Hello. So thanks for tuning in to my Zoom meeting. This is actually going to be a recorded meeting. You guys will see that. So you guys have access to it at any point if you need to just check back to see how you should be going about this. So partly I'm doing a mock presentation to kind of show you a little bit more so what I expect for this project, but also to kind of give you a walkthrough on Zoom. So I'm going to be sharing my screen so you guys kind of see how to do that. All right, so go ahead. So what you'll see when you're looking at your Zoom account, once you have your video already started, there's a little toolbar along the bottom, and dead in the center of it, if you hover over that toolbar, is a green arrow that says share screen. So you want to hit that. I'm hitting that now. It gives you an option of what you'd like to bring up. Go ahead and hit my desktop. Probably just fiddle around with things here. All right, so I have my project over here, my presentation preloaded, and I'm just going to be showing it to you guys through Zoom and through Preview. I would say either use Preview or use Google Slides or use PowerPoint if you have it. Just for this quick mock-up, I'm just using Preview as it's already on my computer. Okay, so I have it loaded here. You should be able to see exactly what's going on my screen now. So at the top, you should have some sort of title. I'm kind of grouping my artists in a couple different ways. I ask that you only use one, but I'm showing you two different ways to approach it. So one way would be formally, so technically, or a technique that the artists you are looking at have in common with the painting you make. So that's desaturated color. And then the other way to approach it would be a certain subject matter, certain inclination of the artist that you see that you have in your own work as well. So for that second part, I have photographic memories, because as you'll see, a lot of these artists are kind of working from photographs and hearkening back to memory. So I'll go ahead and start my presentation. And as I said, this is going to be a quick mock-up. It's not so much for you to get information right now, so there are going to be some parts that are left out, and I'll explain what I want more so for your presentation, but it is a way to kind of show you what I expect. All right. Okay, so you should be seeing the images in full screen now. One thing that might be helpful, especially as we look at this. Normally when my students are doing this in class, there are hard copies of your outline for the project. So we all can follow along to what you're saying, but since we don't have that, it'd be smart to just put some text down below each image just to give us a little bit what's going on. So once again, my presentation is about desaturated colors and photographic memories. The first image is a painting by an artist who I think is pretty important for this whole group. His name is Luc Tuymans. He's a Belgian artist. Luc Tuymans is probably in his 60s at this point, and he's an artist who's always working from photographs. He's usually, as you could see with this image, painting it pretty loosely. So here we see the interior of a room that has like a drain in the center and some sort of metal work over in the corner. Could be a cell, could be something like that. Often he's painting things that have some sort of heavy history, heavy historical content in it, and he's trying to paint it in a way, I think, that makes it feel like a memory. So often he's using desaturated colors, colors that are very washed out. This is another painting of his. This is actually a painting of a painting that's on a book cover. And the painting is of Stephen Biko. Stephen Biko was a religious political prisoner in South Africa. He was persecuted, and coincidentally, or maybe not so much, and this is why Tuymans keeps coming back to this work, Belgium had a huge hand in colonization in Africa. So I think often he's looking at things that are kind of tied to historical, the larger historical narrative, but also his own personal narrative as a European man. Okay. So along with that, and as I said, an image like this, I think he's painting it both desaturated to look like a memory, but also in a way to make it look almost like an old photograph, someone in his family or someone in someone else's family. And one of the things I noticed with his work and a lot of people's work I'll be showing you is that he's almost making these things feel mundane or anticlimactic. So we'll keep that in mind as well. So with this image, this is also of Toyman's work, another one of his oil paintings. These are just pigeons kind of mowing about at night. This is Toyman's talking in front of his work, in the museum. I put this one in here, obviously, so you should get a sense of scale. So even though these images are often of things that are mundane, even this Stephen Biko one, even though it may not be mundane it may have not been mundane in the moment, it does feel more mundane now because we don't really have any connection to it, so it just looks like a picture. Even though they're kind of basic, I think is another way to explain it. I think he paints them in a way that they feel very monumental. So I think he has a way of making the content or the subject matter kind of fluctuate between feeling really, really important on a cultural level and maybe a little bit more personal, if we think of like personal narrative, personal knickknacks around our house. Toyman's had a huge effect on a whole group of artists, and actually this was written about in Art Forum, which is a journal about art. This was written about in a kind of quintessential article called The Toyman's Effect. 3 artists that he had an effect on were Wilhelm Sasnal, Eberhard Havikos, and those are the 2 artists I'll be talking about. These are works by Wilhelm Sasnal. He's a German artist, and a little bit younger than Toyman's, but working in a similar way. As I said, kind of looking at imagery that is pretty mundane. The everyday is another way to think about it. So imagine stepping on a splinter and then having to pick that out. But I think the way in which he paints it with this desaturated color, it's almost monochromatic, but just has a hint of blue in there. I think that way he approaches it makes it instantly feel like a memory. So all of a sudden, this moment that may have been personal for someone, or maybe it's just this universal thing, kind of can fluctuate between those 2. It's more work by Sasnal. And this was actually an installation at an art fair of his, or art fair he was included in. So we could see that the work is pretty consistent, or I should say the subject matter of the work is pretty consistent here, but that's not always the case with these artists. As we saw with Toyman's just earlier, it ranges from everything from a kind of desolate and blank interior space to imagery of a political prisoner to pigeons at night. So very random. Here, the subject matter is a little bit tighter, but because it's approached the same way with the desaturated color, it feels like a memory, and maybe even it feels like a dream sequence. This is actually a source material for one of Sasnal's paintings, and the source material is a very famous photograph of the artist Robert Smithson. So what he's done here is cropped in and zoomed way, way uncomfortably close in on Smithson's crotch in the edge of this chair. But what I find fascinating about this image is, especially because this photograph here is so important in art history, in the myth of art, especially during the 60s and 70s. Just by giving this little sliver of information, we're kind of keyed in onto what he's looking at. Okay. So these last couple of images, or these next couple of images, are by Eberhard Havikos. Hard name to pronounce, harder name to figure out. So this would be a good example of why having text under the image might be helpful, not just for yourself, but also for people looking along, including myself. One of the things you'll notice about his work, it's infused with so much more color, but I think at once it's familiar that it's from a photograph. It's familiar that it's from a photographic source. To me, what does it is this slight blur he has over everything. It's almost like he's painted things and then he's come back over and smoothed it out with a big brush. So those of you who are familiar with oil paint, you know how it can remain tacky for a bit and you could smooth it out a little bit later. So everything almost has like these fast lines on it, or this slight blur. Okay. Once again, he's picking up on things that are would be universal for us, or maybe very personal for him. But either way, it feels like we've been there before. So it somewhat feels like a dream, but maybe also how it's cropped makes it feel a little bit like a film still or something that feels very cinematic. Next artist we're looking at here is, he wasn't necessarily influenced by Toymans, but I think he fits in there in a similar way. He's always working from photographs, so that's one reason I think he's important. He's usually using color in a desaturated way, but I think he's always pointing back to memory, and in his case, he's looking back at kind of Eurocentric and even German specific memory, being a German artist who must be in his 60s now. So he's always looking back at kind of this tattered history of Europe. In this image here, I believe this project is called 48 Portraits. And we see portraits and they look like photographs, but they're actually oil paintings. And we see that he's focusing on all men, all white men, but specifically men of science and literature, of math, of thought, who would have been important up into Gerhard Richter's life. So this is a painting of Kafka, the author, painting of Tchaikovsky. He also had a project that was pretty important where he focused on, how would I say this? He focused on a group of political fighters who were somewhat anarchists. They were called the Baader-Meinhof Group. There was a film that came out about them that kind of went through their exploits called the Baader-Meinhof Complex. I want to say it's 10 or 15 years old now. That was in the late 60s, early 70s. Toymans revisited this work. I want to say it was in the 80s. So he's given some time to pass, and he's gone back to the photographs from that group and painted them in a way that kind of points to the fact that they're both historical, but also points to the fact that they're coming from a photograph. And I think that's a really important part. So here what we're looking at, and most of the images from that series are pretty abstracted, but here what we're looking at is a funeral procession. So we could see 1, 2, 3 caskets here. Forgive the dumpster trucks outside. We could see 1, 2, 3 caskets here, and then just a series of heads as these caskets are being carried, I guess, to their final resting spot. The group was eventually found, caught, tortured, and there's a lot of kind of dark history that goes along with that. So I think what Richter would have been doing here 10 years after this would have been very political and very hot. What he would have been doing here is going back to it, painting it as a memory, almost as a dream, with this blurry sequence, this blurry effect he has here, and then asking us to reconsider it, right? This is another one of Richter's paintings, and this one actually is of imagery that's a lot closer to home for us. We could see the 2 towers here, the Twin Towers from New York, the World Trade Center. And this one's pretty interesting because I think it's a good example of how Richter has used his form to really talk about the content. One of the things we notice in this last painting is that everything seems very blurry. Richter has a technique, I guess it would be, or a signature or trademark thing he does to his paintings where he paints them, he waits till they almost dry, and then he gets a big squeegee, almost like you would clean your car windows with, and he goes over the painting and just smooths it out. we imagine there's a bit of chance that goes on there. I don't think you can control it too much. But in this case, it worked out perfectly because it actually looks like a scar on the building. It looks like smoke coming from the building. We could almost see the exhaust trails off the back of the airplane. And all that said, it's a pretty abstracted image, but it's pretty powerful if you're familiar with the image. Okay, so the next thing you guys should do, you're going to talk about 3 to 5 artists. 3 to 5 images for each one of them, giving you 15 to 20 images about, and then you should include an image of your artwork, right? You should include the painting you're making for this project, and that painting should have at least one of the techniques you've talked about for your project, right? So I'm going to show you just 2 paintings I've made here, and I'll talk about them very, very briefly, just so you can see what I'm talking about. So this first painting here is called Sneaker. I did this series of paintings where I was watching kind of these formulaic cop shows, NCIS, CSI, Law and Order, something like that. I was watching this show. It's getting really loud now. Bear with me. Okay. So I was watching these cop shows, and you know the type of show. It's an hour long. There are 2 commercial breaks. It totals to 48 minutes running time, and starts with a crazy story and ends with a pretty nice bow on the end of it. And there was something about that seemed off to me, so I was really interested in finding this moment where everything just comes together. So I would watch these shows and watch it with the camera and try to like almost guess where the climax would come to pass, and I would shoot that. What would happen is, because I'm shooting a moving image, I would always get a somewhat blurry image, something that had a little bit of tracers on it, something that was blown out, something that the colors were almost oversaturated, and that's what we're looking at here. So this image is of a painting titled Sneaker. Damn. All right, I think they've got it willed in now. So this image is a painting titled Sneaker. It's kind of a play on words, and that's something I'm also interested in because I think language is kind of pretty particular in terms of how we understand the imagery. So it's a play on words in terms that it's a shoe, but also we have this dark shrouded figure who's stepping out from a doorway. We could kind of see the paneling along the wall in this old tenement building. So it just stood out to me as like a pretty powerful image. I think we could start to think about who that body is without it being too specific. And then that was something I was really interested, which is how are these formulaic TV shows kind of giving us a scripted understanding of the world. So that's Sneaker. This next one here is called Alleyway. And what we see here, it's kind of a strange view of it, but this is one of those kind of, I guess you would call it action scenes during a chase scene through the alley. So maybe may have been the same figure being chased out the hallway, runs down the fire escape, you know, scuttles down, gets down into the alleyway. Of course it's raining, and of course it's in New York. And then there's these kind of these kind of views that make the viewer really kind of out of place, but also aware of place at the same time. So that's one of the things I'm doing in these works, which maybe hopefully harkens back to the artist in my project. I'm kind of thinking about how abstract I can make it, but also how much I can make it refer back to the original photograph. So that's going to end my presentation. My presentation went, I'm guessing, a lot longer than yours. because the dumpster day, but also partly because I'm doing quite a bit of explaining here. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this and sign off. And when you're done with this, you'll just go ahead and hit stop share. And then you should just be back to showing your face. At this point, you can hit stop recording. This is up in your top left. And then it should save this as an MP4. So I'm gonna sign off now, but that's that.